No, you should be good to go. Whenever you're ready, we'll click send.
Okay, well, I think we're ready. So I will call the meeting to order. And has there been declaration of public notice?
Yes, there has.
All right, then we will move right into the only item on the agenda, really the updated 2020-2021 reopening plan. And Dan, you want to start with phase 2 discussion? Maybe, or what,
Sure.
I'll let you, whatever you want to start with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll, if it's okay, I'll just share my screen briefly. I think, most of the stuff on the written memo you've seen before, but I'll just highlight a couple of things and then we'll, take that off, so.
Okay.
Okay, get the right screen there. All right. So again, front page, the background, of course, is all information just as a refresher about the whole timeline of everything that's happened up to this point. Second page, we went through pretty much in depth at our last meeting with regard to the updated requirements and recommendations from public health. Just there as a reference. Third page, again, as a reference on our flow chart on our phase reopening and how they align with the public health recommendations. Also just included some policy for once schools are reopened for temporary or emergency closures, of course, are covered by, policy and so on. The data dashboard, even though we no longer have this as a criteria by public health for opening or closing, of course, we still want to keep track of the data that we have, both, there's several key things, but they continue to give us updates with regard to case averages, as well as positivity rates and so on, and something we'll, continue to track and keep our eye on. And then this is probably a more important document if it comes to looking at case numbers. Again, this was really more indicators by CDC. Again, we've gone through this before. The most important thing I just want to emphasize again are the third part of that about in order to have the lowest risk of transmission in schools, they give 5 key indicators or key mitigation strategies that are essential. And we do, in fact, have all 5 of those in place for our reopening. Again, I don't want to underestimate how important this is. Consistent and correct use of masks, social distancing, to the largest extent possible, hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, cleaning, disinfection, and contact tracing. Again, as we go through, if there's questions about any specifics, we can answer those as well. Okay, so this is the real part of the report with regard to the phase 2 reopening for grades 3 through 5. Again, the top part is we've gone through many times with the board with regard to the hybrid instructional model. Again, phase 2 is a continuation. Grade 3, 5 are identical to our 4K2 with regard to the instructional model. Obviously, they're all elementary based. And so it's just repeating the exact same process that we did for phase 1. What is new in this document is the implementation timeline at the bottom of the page. And so again, the things that happen during that implementation are the same as we went through with K2. Clearly, in this case, we, instead of having a target date of second semester and having things spread out a little bit, we're looking at what is the most efficient way that we can get through these while still understanding that we're still continuing the implementation for K2 at the same time. And with this timeline, by really condensing things, we're making a recommendation then that we'll have complete and that we can have students in the building to begin the hybrid instructional model on February 8th. And then that takes us to the last page of the recommendation. Again, continuing phase 1 or finalizing that implementation. Phase 2 is what's new as far as the date. And then we'll talk a little bit after we're done with phase 2. We can talk a little bit about the planning on phase 3 with the grades 6 through 12. So again, I went through that real quickly, and we can go back to any parts of that and answer questions. We've got our administrative team with us here this evening and can go into as much detail as you would like. So would you like, is there any reason to keep the screen shared while we go through discussion, or is it easier to?
Just one quick question, Dan. Is this available to the public yet?
It will be in about 30 seconds when Joyce moves it to there. Thank you. Reminder.
So questions, Eric?
And Dan, forgive me if this is something you're going to cover later on, but my question would be, as part of the phased reopenings, has there been some thought about moving from the 2-day hybrid model to a full week hybrid model, phasing that in as well with the grades? Or have there only been consideration of the 2-day hybrid model?
Right, we've stayed with the same model of the 2-day week.
Do you, well, I suppose this would be a decision for us to discuss, but I guess I would be curious to see, as we start to phase in eventually more grades, up to K5 and to 6-12, maybe when we get to the 6-12 stage, that might be a place to look at a 4 or 5-day a week model as we're increasing, the opportunities for our students. Or did you just envision like the 2-day hybrid model carrying it throughout?
Sure, that's the plan, is to carry it throughout. Remember, the reason for the 2-day is we are cohorting kids into 2 sections to have smaller, groups of students. So if you go to 4 days, that's no longer a hybrid. That's full implementation, in which now you have double the number of students in the building.
Well, right, but my thoughts are just eventually we want to get to that point. I don't think we're there yet, but we want to get to that point. When we do get to that point, it would be nice to do a little pre-planning so that we know how we're going to do it when we get to there.
Sure.
In case there may be changes with classroom sizes, teacher allocation, those types of things.
Yeah. So sure, we can talk about that, but yeah, that's an easy implementation because that's our normal model. That's an instructional model.
Right. But we're adding the precautions, so it would change a little bit.
Yeah.
But in order for that to happen, the distance requirement would have to change. I mean, currently, we're still required to keep 6 feet of distance, right? And that's the main reason we can't move from the hybrid. So if things improve dramatically in the county in this next semester and that requirement gets dropped, I mean, is that the only thing standing in the way of going full time?
Right. Well, and that's right.
Right.
And as you know, that's, not only county, that's CDC. I mean, the physical distancing.
Statewide. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Susan, you had your hand up, and then Lorraine.
And could you add, I know some of the other districts do it, and it's really helpful to have, could you add our school district dashboard to the school reopening plan so that we can see the Dane County graph, but it would be nice to be able to see ours as well?
Sure. I mean, we'll have that when we have students in the building. Right now, there aren't students to track.
Okay.
Is that what you mean, that dashboard? Yeah.
Yep. That'd be great. Thank you.
You bet.
And Lorraine.
And then again, I would also, I don't have a question, but I would also support, and maybe you want to call it phase 5, and that will be continuing to setting a goal. And if our goal is to move back to full in person, and it may be in a year or this September, that I think is helpful to have part of the plan. So when you were doing this plan before and you looked back, the plan just stopped at 4K2. Now you've got all the classes in it, which is really great. And it looks like a district-wide plan. So maybe you offer another line that shows where you will move next.
Sure.
Whatever that is.
No, I appreciate that, Susan. Just to clarify, if you don't mind, can I just go back here just briefly to make sure we're on the same page? So when you look at the flow chart, we're talking about, the phased opening, which we're in the process of now, and then eventually with the goal of the full return to students. So I just want to make sure that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, actually, I'm looking more at page, I think it's page 7 of the handout, the very last page, where you do a narrative
got it.
of each of the plans. And so then it would just be a phase. And then under that phase, you could just say goal.
Yeah.
moving to in-person, and then maybe we'd understand that maybe your first larger class in person would be only 4K2. Maybe it goes back that same way.
Sure.
Whatever your thoughts may be, just kind of helping us see where you're looking forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
That's what I thought too. Thank you, Susan.
Got it.
That was well said.
Right. Lorraine?
Sure. My question is for the principals. So for the K through 2, do you feel prepared at this point? And what can you share some of the things that you've done for preparation, and then 3 through 5 as well? What things have you done to prepare for school opening?
I can go. We've done a lot as far as, initially it was looking at all the survey information and then determining how many classes we would need. From that, it was individual or small group conversations with various teachers, educational assistants, our special education staff, pretty much everybody in the building to determine who would be coming back, looking at those that had medical need and who could not come back into the building. We've been working a lot with our school nurses and getting our building set up. So there's tape on the floor. Our classrooms are taking shape as far as having that 6-foot distancing and spaces for all the students that will be coming back. We have been working on a lot of kind of policy procedures within our building of how you enter and exit the building, how you use the bathrooms, how we'll have lunch. We've been creating videos for our school, kind of going through the routines that we'll be sharing and rolling out with families. Those aren't done yet, but definitely in the process of getting there. We've been working with the district a lot on, finalizing every time there are changes, the policies and procedures so we're all following that. Really working with staff and their understanding and knowledge of what needs to happen. Answering a lot of parents' communication too, related to questions they might have related to placements, and working as a collective team to have a clear communication out to families. So that's been some of it. Angie and Reed, I'm sure you have more to add that I've missed.
That was a pretty good list. The only other things I can think of, there's now safety barriers, plexiglass in the office that was installed. The nurses have been working on the isolation room where students will go if they're showing symptoms. They've been working on some of the communication that will be shared with parents and with staff around procedures if they're showing symptoms. Tape went down on the floorways for traffic, or on the hallway floors for traffic patterns. They've also been taping classroom areas for students so that students have a visual of where their 6-foot bubble is for themselves in the classroom. Yeah, those are some of the other ones that I thought of.
Danielle, you want to go? Second grade.
Sure. Everyone has just, spoken so well about all the things we've done. To add one more thing, I think the biggest thing that we have done is just allowed for space for creativity. We've been talking to our staff about their needs and allowing them to be really clear about what they may need. I mean, we don't know what we're going to need, full transparency, but we're trying our best to provide the space for dialogue to be innovative. So our teachers have put in a list last week to Reed and I about some things that they think they will need as far as to help instructionally. And so we put those things on order. And so we are allowing our teachers to use as much space as possible because of the 6 feet parameters that we're working with, but also to be as creative and to bring the fun back into learning. And so I think at this point, it turned and shift from like a lot of anxiety to a lot of, man, I'm looking forward to coming back into the space, which is really good. And in addition to that, We have opened up some time for teachers to collaborate together with their hybrid teams and their virtual teams. I know at Taylor Prairie, we've had separate conversations and work groups together. And so Connie has been very proactive with getting everyone together to talk about like work streams, what that will look like, how we can navigate within the spaces that we have been using currently, but how we can be more innovative within that. And then for hybrid as well, like what supports do you need? How can we lift those things? And so we can have meaningful conversations with families when we do make this transition and shift. At Cottage Grove, Reed and I did some walkthroughs of classrooms and played around with some configurations of rooms. And we're confident that, you know, we're ready. Like this is, at first was daunting, but to be very frank with you all, I think that we're in a really good space and place.
So you can see that there's a whole bunch of collaboration happening amongst us as principals. Every week, it's twice a week at minimum. And you can see like with Danielle, it gets this opportunity to work with Cottage Grove staff and Taylor Prairie staff. And so there's a lot of links across buildings on how we're trying to be creative, but yet follow the guidelines and do what's best. I think ultimately there's this opportunity to, with this next phase is to, we need, a timeline that we can do this thoughtfully as we did with the 4K2. And so same process, but so we won't have to reinvent anything, but it's a matter of rolling it out the same way that we did with 4K2. And that's with really constant and clear communication with staff and then with families. So with staff, it's like today we had a meeting with staff just to listen to their questions again, and that you can't do that enough almost in a way. You just want to continue to be there because different things come up at different times for them, and you want to support their anxiety, but also let them know they can do it. They were trained to do this work, and we have an incredible staff here in our district. So
I'm going to just add a couple more things. I think we should be saying too that we have been in communication with Nelson Bus Company and Jarrett, and definitely with the food service. So we're making, all the connections so we can have all the right things in place, and definitely working on making sure we have the right PPE for teachers so that they feel comfortable coming back and doing their job. So that's all of us are doing those same things.
I have two questions.
Wait,
the first one is,
Eric,
Oh, sorry. Lorraine had one other one, and then we'll go to Eric. Okay, go ahead.
3 through 5, can you share any preparation?
Yeah, so I'll start and then Reed and Chris can fill in. So, I mean, we just started having the conversation. They have been a part of like a lot of our informational sessions even with 4K through 2. So like heard about some of the building procedures, heard about and got to talk through the ABAB instructional model. So they had been a part of some of those conversations. So today was, I think Reed referred to it, that first step in like hearing some of their concerns. They're just starting to think of like, okay, like what does this really truly look like? And so we had some really good listening sessions today to start answering those questions. We also all sent out our staff preference survey today. So we have that information to start looking at, to start figuring out which Connie mentioned that we'll do meetings after break, but that initial survey to find out which staff are comfortable and what information we need to make those decisions about virtual or hybrid. Yeah.
And so we did the same today with included 5th grade from GDS. So Chris was there, Nate and James, myself, and then Lisa joined in too. So that was for 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And then all of the resource, all the paraprofessionals, all the related arts teachers, Encore teachers were there to, again, we gave some voice to initial planning. They've been able to see the AB cohort model document that that Lisa and Emily put together, and we reshared that to answer some of their questions. And then again, to really emphasize, the preference survey is just for teachers to be able to rank their comfortability on returning, and that's individual, but that helps us gauge what kind of teaching staff would be able to work with the hybrid. And also we need staff to continue to be our virtual staff as well.
Just a follow-up question for 3 through 5. Do you feel prepared then to start in February then?
I'll chime in just a little bit. Just reading Angie and everybody who's been working on the pre-K 2 has definitely been helpful. For us, GDS is obviously one of the buildings that doesn't have that young of students, so we haven't been involved. I've been able to see everything they're doing, and I've been able to be at the meetings and things like that. But I would say our staff is they're a little bit stressed, and it's hard right now because we're kind of giving them this information, right before break. And so today, Reed and I very much encouraged our teachers to take the break, and that we would, get back on this after break. At GDS, we have really focused on the 5th grade pods and trying to get them at least cleaned and organized and ready. But I do think the teachers are a little bit kind of in shock since, for the last couple of days. So, but, I think the timeline that has been created here, unless we run into some major glitches, and because so much of the heavy lifting has already been done, I do think we can make it by February 8th.
Thank you.
Okay, Eric?
Well, Chris, you kind of answered my question. Thank you. I was just I was curious, Chris and Mitch, if you had a chance to see what the elementary schools are doing. So eventually when that gets to the middle schools and the high schools, that you're kind of prepared for a model of the precautions that are going to be put in place and the safety measures that are going to be put in place in the different environments.
Yeah, I would say from the high school, Eric, it's been very informative to be in all of the meetings and following the planning and just really the sequence of planning, whether it's the logistics and protocols aspect or the instructional model piece. Just listening to the sequence that they went through, and Dan talked about at the start of the meeting surveying I think our older students in terms of coming back, and we would go through a very similar process at the high school in terms of the process. We have some different challenges at the high school, not anymore, but just different. And so we would be tending to those as well.
And then Dan, just a quick question for you. Actually, it's a request. I'm going to speak for myself because I know everybody has different situations, but I would like to be present at one of the schools for the reopening on the day of the reopening, to be there and be present and stand with the teachers that are coming into work as a board member, and maybe help greet the students as they come in, if that's possible to do that. Absolutely.
I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Susan?
Dan,
Susan,
just to kind of finish out the school reopening plan, you've put a calendar on the end, and I think that was just put up this afternoon. So I want to make sure that community members who haven't seen it yet know that it's there. Could you just give us a quick overview of the calendar? The ones I've seen before seem to be a little clearer. So for instance, on the one that I looked at before, it would say 4K2 virtual, and that would be one color. And then at the point that they were changing to in person, it was 4K2, but a virtual, an in-person color. So, so it says 4K2 only, and then there's October, November, December. Could you just explain that?
Sure, be glad to. So at this point, this calendar represents our implementation stage. since we don't have the students in the building yet. And so it is color coded that, so the green is the K2, 4K2 implementation.
Would you be able to share that?
Oh, I'm sorry, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's on board docs. If you just refresh, you should see it.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's the same information that's on the written timeline that you've had in the previous documents. But then I'll just share it out with the key showing the implementation and the overlap between the planning for the 4K2, the 3-5, and then what they have in common, 4K through 5. And so you'll see that, of course, the planning for 4K2 started back on October 26th, following the board action through November. And then the red or light red or pink is where the grade 3 through 5 planning started. And then the blue is overlap where there's working on the implementation of both. So Susan, we'd be glad to update this calendar and add on to it the actual, with the students in the building. This is the implementation up to that point.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So it would be nice if you put implementation stage on there, because then you'd know what the colors meant. And that would show that those were the time periods you were working on that class. But I think what I'd like to be able to see is the plan, the actual plan for what you're going to be doing. So I would look at January 25th, and I'd see 4K2 with a color that says virtual, that tells me, that says in person or hybrid. So I would know at that point, they would change from their virtual color to their hybrid color.
Got it. So, and absolutely.
Maybe, and that's, again, it's a little different theme, but again, it's so helpful to have this document and be able to see what the work plan is. That's great. So 4-3-5 only. So it's my impression that you have had some, there's no definitive plan, but you have had some discussion about high school. So you're not putting a color up for 6-8 yet, or 9-12, because you don't have an implementation stage, right?
Right. So with the 6-12, the next time we come together, we'll have a similar, timeline and implementation stage to share and update it at that point.
Great,
There's certainly been obviously planning going on, but we'll finalize that timeline.
Great.
All right. Any other questions about 3-5, Peter?
I'd like to know, I would like to be ready to open 3-5 on January 25th with the K through 2, 4K through 2. When I look at the now sharply dropping case rate in Dane County, I believe that we might be ready sooner than later. Knock on wood. Of course, it'll all melt down. This new strain from England could blow this all up. Who knows? But I would like to see us plan to have 3-5 ready. And it seems to me that doing it at the same time would be easier. And maybe I'm wrong with that. But is that a possibility? At least plan for it as we go forward at this point?
Well, we looked at that really closely, and our initial thought was, yes, it makes sense to be able to open at the same time. The challenge is, of course, with the planning, we're at different phases, stages of that. And so there's a lot of things that are still going on, with regard to, the scheduling, the final scheduling and so on with the 4K2. And I guess the real reason too, if you look at the schedule that we have in place, there's really nowhere that can be condensed in order to get to that point. Those things that take time as far as developing the class section, the bus routes, scheduling into the Infinite Campus. So as much as that was kind of the original goal, we realized, and then the other piece is just having, the communication and so on with staff. So yeah, that absolutely was when we first looked at this we really looked at 2 calendars. What it would look like to try to have it finished by then, as well as this date. And we concluded that this was, the preferred schedule. But if there's any questions about any of those specific parts of the timeline, about why does it take that long and so on, we're glad to answer those.
Yeah, I have a question.
Elizabeth, and then Susan.
Yeah, I had the same question as Peter, because when we left last week, we were trying to operate on the idea that we'd meet on the 25th, right? Or, that we'd be able to be in person for both grade levels or both grade spans on the 25th. And I'm curious because I don't obviously have a deep sense of what the nuances are around developing class sessions and the teacher EA and the bus routes, but curious to know about if we can find some efficiencies in there, and if not, why not? Because I just don't understand the process deep enough to really fully appreciate why there's that length of time for those 3 specific tasks.
Yeah. Well, why don't I start, and then I'm going to let the principals and others chime in who are actually doing that work. But I think if you look at the implementation of that, we have the parent surveys due on January 6th, and the staff preference forms due on the same place. That's the first piece is we have that information. So from that point on, what happens? And then you've got 2 key pieces: developing the sections, developing the teaching assignments. So perhaps our team can talk a little bit about what happens with those processes and who's all involved with that, and during those basically 2-week time periods.
Well,
Yeah, that would be helpful. And sorry, Reed, just like I understand too on the reason for the 6th, I feel like that's the earliest possible time, given when you're going to deploy those surveys, when you could actually get results, given the fact that everyone's on break. And so then that gives you a few days to like re-engage family members, for example, who haven't filled it out, or staff that you may need to re-engage. So the 6th I get, it's sort of that interim section between the 6th and the 8th that I have questions about. So I'm sorry, Rita, I interrupted.
Not a problem at all. I think one thing we've talked about, the word I've heard and our staff has heard throughout this process is this concept of a phased approach. And so with that being said, when last week the things changed, I think that was a relative surprise to a lot of our staff members. And then to quickly go from it changed to hearing that the 25th was a possibility. I think it does matter to give our staff enough time to be prepared and ready for making sure that we can do both at the same time the right way. And so when we talk about the big things like class rosters, schedules is a big part of it that hasn't been necessarily mentioned, busing, but then there's other parts to the schedule that just aren't commonly known about. What about related arts and how you manage staff that goes from different buildings and schedules to make sure students get equal access to related arts and follow protocols for what we're under the guidance, through the county and state. Next, you talk about all of our students to get additional services. And we have to find out, again, the choices that those families make. Some will choose virtual, some will choose hybrid. And so it's just not a randomized class list. It's very thoughtful. We're trying to reduce the amount of students that have to change teachers. We know that's inevitable, that some will, but we're trying to be very thoughtful in that, and also be very thoughtful in how much time, just be prepared physically as a building and mentally for our staff to be able to do the best job they can, and to be able to follow the protocol that's been presented tonight. I think does all of those things in a way that we can do this the best way we can.
I can maybe add a little too, really trying to stick through or with our ICS model of looking at student needs and then making sure that we are being very thoughtful in that transition of students. So when a student leaves teacher A and goes to teacher B, like how are we allowing time for that communication to happen? Making sure we call them ISAGs are ready for kids that we need to have a little bit more of a plan developed for them. Making sure too that our co-planning, could potentially change as we have a virtual track and a hybrid track, and how do we still maintain where the teachers are able to come together to share on standards and learning targets and the success criteria, and then how are we going to have some differences because they're going to be teaching in kind of different worlds. And I think the one thing we still have to remember is that maybe we're available sometime during the day, but teachers are still teaching 100% of their day. And so trying to fit in meetings with different, groups of teachers or educational assistants can be a little bit challenging. We still expect them to be 100% full-time teaching. And so it is just trying to navigate all worlds effectively and for the best interest of our students. So, I think, we say to get a job done, it takes twice as long and you seem like you only get 2/3 of it done sometimes. And so I just want us to be really thoughtful in that process, that it seems like we should just be able to do it, but we don't have access to everybody, like walking down the hall as you would if they were in person. So it does take a little bit longer, unfortunately, to get things done, but thoughtful.
Okay, then Susan.
Thank you guys very, very much. For me as a board member, this has been an incredibly helpful and important discussion because it does reinforce that we really need to understand not just what the principals are having to do during this process, but also what all the staff is having to do to prepare. I know when we did the tour of Winnequa School, I noticed that we hadn't set up the desks looked just like they did in the spring. We hadn't done any of the setting up or thought about the desks. So I think that does go to the point that I think we need some good direction on the phase-in plan for 6-8, because it's somewhat concerning when at least two of the principals have said our teachers were really surprised. I thought that as a board member, we're going to look at this to go back, and then when this one's ready to go back, we'll look at this one and then this one. And now we have the pathway from Dane County for a phased in work. So even if it isn't, you don't start working on it till March, having that discussion with the teachers and talking about it and getting their input, and kind of seeing some dates for how those are happening so that we don't have this feeling that we're surprising our teachers by coming forward with a plan. So I'd like to see us kind of, if we can, start to put at least a month in on 6-8 for at least planning and discussing with teachers, a plan. So that would be helpful. Thank you.
Elizabeth, and then Lorraine.
Yeah, so thank you, Connie and Reed, for sort of elucidating on that section. That was really, really helpful. And it makes sense to me, right? To be smart and planful. But since, like I said, we're not privy to like that level of conversation, it's just nice to get those full details. And I agree with Susan Manning, actually. I think, Reed, your point around all of a sudden staff who, were watching their colleagues, their 4K2 colleagues kind of go through this and like, oh, that'll be me eventually. And all of a sudden, overnight, to the extent that our board meetings carry overnight, right, all of a sudden now impacts them, and what that feels like to them, right, and what that means and how unprepared maybe they were for that, I think speaks a lot about how we have been engaging with this thus far, right? So to reiterate Susan Manning's point, I think we want staff to recognize that we are moving forward in this really particular way and at least have their eyes on, here it's coming down this particular time, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But I think we do our staff a disservice if we're as a board trying to function in a way that, let's say, gets 6-8 in, and our staff is like caught off guard about that, right? Then it kind of throws everybody off kilter. And so I think this is a good lesson learned for us moving forward and being really explicit about, now that we're really thinking in phasing in, what does that actually look like for everybody, particularly for our 6-12 staff who like haven't been in the building at this point. It'll be like almost a year, right? By the time that we're talking about phasing that minimum, that's a really long time to be out of your traditional workspace. And so I think we need to socialize sooner and more often.
Can I respond to that a little bit? So one of the things, a couple things. One is, I just want to remind everybody, like Winnequa staff got in right before school started because construction went until that very first week. So they didn't get any time in their classrooms before school started. So just one quick thought about that. And then the other thing, I don't want to speak for Reed, but we talked about it earlier today, is I think that our 3 through 5 staff have been a part of these conversations for sure and knew that it was eventually coming. I do think the surprising part was when Dane County changed their guidelines and kind of went from that 39 mark for 3 through 5 to like open. It was wide open for all. And so that was more the surprising part than, of like that happened super quick, right? So that part is the part that what kind of took everybody off guard, of like, we didn't know exactly what those new guidelines were going to look like. And so, and it ended up being much more wide open, which is good. And so we're ready to get on board for 3 through 5 for sure. So.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, Angie. And I just wanted to clarify that, I'm not, throwing any judgment or blame on kind of why that happened or how that happened. Like, I agree. I think the point that like all of a sudden it doesn't feel very phasey is a real one, but it is a reality that we're currently facing. So let's, take a lesson from it and then try to make it feel phasey for our folks so that we can kind of socialize them into it in a way that doesn't cause angst, right? Because then it's going to inhibit the planning, right? Because then the first thing you need to do is regulate it down and then move forward on the planning. And so it's just, it kind of slows everything down, but not because anyone did anything wrong per se, but I think it does enlighten us as a board around how we think about our discussions and how we lay the groundwork more explicitly, I think, than we have been previously.
Thanks, Angie. I think that is a good description, but I also wonder from the board's perspective, the conversation when there was following the public health and the following all the regulations, and all of a sudden the regulations completely loosen up. Did you feel as a board like your mind changed? Because that's a surprise too. And it's just a different way. For a whole long time, we were told a number, then all of a sudden that changes. And I don't speak in that way to make the staff sound like they're ready. They'll knock this out of the ballpark just like they did last spring, just like they did this fall, and just like they're going to do with K2 and with 3-5 and the whole boat of them. But they weren't surprised in the fashion that they can't do it. They were just surprised that we've been following different numbers up until that date. And so I think that's got to be really clearly defined, just so that no one's thinking that people aren't prepared to be able to make it happen.
Thanks for that, Rita. Yeah, I think we had gotten word, I think the Friday before when Dan sent a report that they were, and well, I think it might have even been in the paper that they would, but that was the earliest where we heard they weren't going to have metrics. I mean, I thought up until then, we thought they'd have just revised metrics. So yeah, that was different. Lorraine, did you have a question too? Okay, go ahead.
I did. So mine is, my question is for student services. So both for special education, and then also with our students being virtual and then coming back, mental health may be compromised. So are we prepared both with special ed and with mental health?
Yeah, I think that's the work that the team has been doing and preparing for. And just, I think they're just going to have to be ready to navigate what it means for this new scenario, right? You mentioned that's a good reflection that anytime there's change, that could change the need. I think there will be students who, will have fewer struggles with mental health, but with any opportunity to get back in school. That's what we're really hoping for. There could be challenges we haven't even, anticipated yet in terms of what that means and just the challenges of reentering an environment, as someone just said, that perhaps you haven't been in nearly a year. So the teams are ready. I think when you think about the folks that have talked about the phased approach and the timeline and the thoughtfulness around it, student services and special education is another element of why the time to do it and do it well is important. Connie and others have mentioned, you know, we had individual meetings once families make the decision, once class placements are decided, you know, if we're asking for any shifts in case management or asking people, you know, with these roles that are very limited, our goal is to give teachers voice and choice and to work within their comfort zones. But again, it's not like they're classroom teachers where there are 6 or 8 of them doing a role. So there is a lot of coaching and support, and just it turned up very different among the 3 buildings with 4K2 in terms of our demographics of students with disabilities who chose to come back or not come back. And that meant very different planning discussions in each building. And, you know, that's a group of individuals that are being asked to navigate both the virtual and the in-person instruction in different ways. And they're figuring it out, and they're being creative, and they're working as a team as they have been. But it's just another layer of the challenge, I think, as to why we're just being really thoughtful about the timeline. And from a student services perspective, yes, I think they will be prepared to respond to the mental health needs as they have been and use the tools that they've been using, but they do have an understanding that this brings a different level of challenge and hopefully some positive changes as well. I know as a group, yeah, they're looking forward to having students in the building as well.
Eric?
Dan, has there been some talk, and maybe if Nicole's on, she can answer this too, about the Federal CARES Act and where that sits right now for the staff that might, you know, be higher at risk, or staff, if they were going to get sick, would want to know what would be the process as far as leave is concerned, because I know that changed and now it looks like it's going to be re-implemented. I'm not sure where that's at right now. So do you or Nicole know where that would be as far as like some protection for staff that are, have pre-existing conditions or more vulnerable staff?
Earlier today, I did check on the Department of Labor's website to see if there's any update, and there wasn't one. So currently it ends on December 31st. As part of the process, like the principals have mentioned, we have reached out to all of our staff to see if anybody does have a health condition that puts them at high risk, or a family member who would be at high risk. And we've been able to accommodate all of those so far. We're still waiting for individuals at 3-5 to get back to us, but we've sent that note out. So hopefully we will still be able to accommodate and keep those individuals virtual so they can be safe and still be in paid status and working. In the event that we might not be able to accommodate that, then we might have to look at different leaves of absence. So I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but I'll keep checking for updates. But so far I've not seen anything.
Okay. And Nicole, if you could communicate with Dan, I'd be interested to know, you know, what if there are any updates, what those are as well. If you could let the board know, that'd be great. And then Dan, I just wanted to, you know, confirm and reassure that the hybrid model, there will be a hybrid option that will stay as we go through these phases. That hybrid option is going to still be there. There may be some changes regarding staff and teachers, but the option of the hybrid learning model will still be in place, correct?
Yeah, yep, and that's there'll absolutely be that choice for families.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Elizabeth?
Sorry, just one more while you're on, Krista. So I think I have a sense of kind of what related arts is going to look like, what the classroom teachers and the EAs may look like, but what is it going to look like for special education staff as well as our student services staff?
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, they are groups where, you know, some of our special education staff have already been seeing some students face-to-face for those additional services and kind of meeting that obligation and doing that on a limited basis. So we already have a variety of staff who are working, some in the building and continuing and also supporting their typical caseload of students virtually as well. Some have been doing 100% virtual to date, and same for our SEAs and those support staff. It's a mix of in-person and virtual support. Our therapists, for example, we do have, there are considerations. We obviously do have staff that cross. Our physical therapist, for example, works in every single building. So there are unique circumstances that we're trying to navigate, similar to related arts, to minimize the contact and increase safety, and think about some of those unique positions. And then with our special education staff, we've really sort of let, as we do with the IEP process, let the students drive the decision. So where they elect to be is where we've prioritized having our staff, with the understanding that, we're covering both worlds with special education. There are a lot of students who will continue to receive their special education service virtually, and that's working well for them. It's the path that they want to take, and we've got to be able to provide that support, as well as now pivot and have our staff be available in the cohort model to support in buildings. I think it does look, as I mentioned, different in every single elementary, just for the 4K2 where the decisions have been made, but some great models and ideas of support, and some ways to split the hybrid and virtual time across the cohorts, and some creative decision-making about classroom placements, and ways, just different teams of support. With the co-planning that someone mentioned earlier, that still is our anchor. That really still is so necessary to plan on behalf of all the students, no matter where they are, and plan with their needs in mind, because it looks different, across and we are asking people to do quite a bit and to be creative, but they're also sharing responsibilities as a team, covering for one another, those that do have reasons why they can't teach, in person currently. We've been able to make accommodations, as Nicole said, and make it work to date. Now it's just a matter of scaling that up from just a few grade levels to, whole scale. So as we, they typically work and balance a lot of pieces, and they'll continue to do so. And student services as well. That's a conversation with the buildings to talk about, what are the needs for both students learning virtually and in person, and figuring out staffing that supports what the building needs.
Great, thank you.
I have a question too, to add on about just a couple. One, we have that day coming up on January 6th where we're meeting with the 4K2 people for additional questions. Did you give any thought to extending that to 3-5 as well, or having a separate time, or where are we with that?
Yeah, if I recall, it was stated briefly at our last meeting. I think it might have been Eric who made a comment that it makes sense that would be extended to 3-5. So thanks for bringing that up to confirm. That was my intention, is to have it for now 4K through 5.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, didn't you just send out a new update about that?
Joyce sent to you as board members, but we have to get the invite out to staff, which will.
Okay, great, thanks. And then my other question is, given that we've said we want parents to stick with their choice through the third trimester, what kind of conversation have you had along the way in terms of if there would be, say, some 4K2 parents who elected to remain virtual, but at that point might decide to come back in person, or if we would even have some additional 3-5 at that point that would make a decision to come back, because that obviously has an impact on staff and classes. And I just wondered where you are with that, or what kind of conversation you had around that.
Yeah, we've had really good question. We had a lot of conversation around that. And, there's really two key factors. Number one, of course, is to provide choice for parents and try to accommodate their requests. But then the second thing is we have to staff it. And so without question, when you give that opportunity to make a different choice, it likely will impact staffing or has potential to. And that's why we thought it was really important that we have a time for parents to make that. So it's just a one-time change. So we think it's important that we give that opportunity for parents at the end of the third quarter or trimester, but we do expect that might mean some staffing changes then as well to accommodate those requests.
And then I guess along that same line, I would guess there are some parents that will elect to stay virtual through the rest of the year. And so is it do you have some staff members who would prefer to stay virtual for the rest of the days? I guess I'm thinking when you regroup these kids, it would be helpful if parents who are really sure they want to stay virtual regardless, if maybe they could be grouped together. So I guess I'm worried about another upheaval at the trimester, is what I'm thinking. And it may not be as many numbers, but even 12 or 20 might make a difference. So I'm just curious whether there's any way to plan ahead for that, or we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
Well, again, there was a lot of conversation about that, and it is a little bit tricky in that because even so, it still means regrouping. So I think, the principals are aware that I think they're going to try to look at that and I don't want to speak for them. They're the ones doing the scheduling and staffing, but ultimately, I think to accommodate the choice is the number one factor. And if that means having to reschedule, it's worth it in order to accommodate the parent choice.
Okay, so we kind of have to see. Any other questions, Peter?
What is the inevitable situation where you have a case ends up in a school, and what does it look like? How do we deal with the quarantine, the isolation, and how do we continue instruction in those cases?
Well, we've got a lot of people working on that. Sean, you want to talk maybe first of all about how that works logistically with our nurses and decisions to quarantine, and then we can talk about. Or did you want to just talk more about the instruction, Peter? Did you want both?
Yeah, both really.
Okay, all right.
So with the process for the quarantining, first we're asking families to do symptom checks for their children before they even come into the building. And in a situation where they identify any of the symptoms that we will be providing them, they would then contact the school nurse, and that school nurse will consult with them about what next steps should be, and more than likely referring them to get in contact with their family healthcare provider. If we were to identify it, if a student were to present symptoms within a building, we would send them to our bubble room, where the school nurse would then go through the symptom checklist. If that checklist says yes, the student should go home, we would ask the parents to be there as soon as possible, and we would do another follow-up consultation with them. If a family were to become aware that their child was a close contact of a positive case, or if the child themselves was a positive case, that would then trigger our contact tracing protocol. In that situation, it's again notifying our school nurse, but also the building administrator, at which point in time we would go through the process of trying to identify any potential close contacts within the school building. In the event that we can identify those close contacts, we would notify those people. And I think there's going to potentially be some situations where we cannot identify all close contacts if there were to be a positive case. And I think really I'm thinking with our elementary school children, because while we are going to try and ensure 6 feet social distancing to the greatest extent possible, but it's going to be challenging for sure at those earliest grade levels. So in that situation, if we cannot identify all close contacts, that would be a situation where we would more than likely have to quarantine that entire classroom. And that's part of the reason why we are cohorting in small groups, is to really limit the amount of out of school instruction for the students selecting the hybrid model. I can answer any other questions related to that as well.
Yeah, so what happens next if you have to quarantine a classroom? Those kids go home for 2 weeks, or actually it's 10 days now, but do they get instruction? I mean, how do we continue?
So for the instructional component, I can definitely let our principals handle that component. But as far as the quarantining timeline, that's really dependent upon the date of exposure to a positive case, and that's done in consultation with our school nursing staff. So when they're having these conversations, they are saying, when were you last exposed? how many days since that exposure, and really figuring out on an individual case-by-case basis of how long they need to be quarantining.
Sure, of course. But then what happens when there is a quarantine? That's what I want to know. I mean, I understand the subtleties, precise the timing and so on. That'll depend on case by case. But now we have a quarantine classroom. What do we do? How do we manage that? Particularly, how do we manage the education?
Sure.
What do we do?
Right. I'm glad to speak to that. So we've managed extended student absences for years, decades, in a variety of ways. We're probably more equipped to manage extended student absences now that we are better at our virtual learning muscles. And so if a student individually is out of school, that classroom teacher will address those students' needs in many of the same ways that they would, let's say, if a student had been out for chickenpox or for strep or mono or something like that. So they would be communicating with the student and the family. They'd be sending work home. In this case, the fortunate part is it could be videos that they're sending, like from Seesaw, and students are now way more proficient at navigating those platforms. Before, it used to probably be a lot of packets. And I think now you'll see a lot more enriched materials that will engage students during extended absences. If you get to a point where an entire cohort is quarantined, that teacher, even though, so here's the question, is cohort A quarantined but not cohort B? And if cohort A is quarantined, is the teacher quarantining? Or is the teacher going to remain with cohort B? But either way, that teacher could then have the option to pivot with that class to virtual instruction for that temporary time period. But I think one of the important parts to note is that that student or that group, the groups of students, would remain under the umbrella of that teacher that they're assigned to receive ongoing work.
Okay.
Susan, I have a question. You're mute.
Sorry, I was saying to go ahead. I was wanting to make sure Peter was finished. Go ahead.
Okay. So generally, most other school districts, if students in a classroom are quarantined, they immediately revert to virtual at home. I may have misunderstood, Lisa, how you were explaining this, but it sounds like you treat them just like a kid who goes home sick for 2 weeks. We have virtual available to those students. So why wouldn't we just click on the switch of virtual?
Although the hybrid students and the virtual learning 2.0 students will be working on the same essential grade level standards, they won't always be at the exact same place and engaging in the exact same work. Obviously, there are going to be some pacing differences with what's happening with hybrid versus what's happening with virtual learning 2.0. To place a student just dropped into another classroom, in some ways you're creating this different ecosystem in that classroom. So for let's say weeks now, this student is with this teacher and that's their new homeroom teacher, and then they're sick. That teacher still wants to take responsibility for that student, but to take that student and then just place them with someone else, they may have no relationship with that teacher or with those kids, or even be in the exact same place with the learning. So I let the principal speak a little more to that, but
yeah, I would be very interested in hearing that, because as a parent, I would, and I'm telling you, I've seen this in other districts. I've had personal experience with this. A child, a classroom, they went in person within a week, they were all quarantined because it was the very beginning of this happening. A student was positive and they were all converted to virtual. To put a student out there and still stay connected, I mean, you can offer the parents the choice, but to say it's more important to have them connected to the teacher they've been with and just receive assignments sent home when we actually have a virtual offering where they could be synchronous, even with it's another teacher. I'm just really struggling with this plan. The big question that I had though, Dan, that's for Dan, is that I thought we had seen a plan that you had written for what would happen if there's a positive student. And maybe I've been looking at other districts too much, but if we don't have a written plan for that occurring, this conversation needs to be in writing so parents can see it and can be aware, because there are going to be exposures in the classroom. And it's not necessarily going to be from classroom contact, but there's going to be students who are exposed in other locations who come in with a positive test. And then you have to decide, once you decide who's exposed, what you're going to offer to those students. And I think we need, seriously, that needs to be in writing. I thought it was, but I must be thinking of other districts. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that I think you misunderstood. If we have an entire class quarantined, yes, it's 100% virtual then. Okay.
What if you have 5 students quarantined out of a class of 10? That's 50% of your class.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to send assignments home to.
But I'm not aware of another district that is having students switch teachers when they're out on quarantine. Okay, well, we talked about.
A lot of them are live streaming.
Sure.
So they bring in the live stream and the student goes virtual on a live stream. I'm just saying we need to be ready for this.
We 100% are ready for that.
A good plan. Well, I think we need a good plan that meets the needs of the students.
Okay.
Peter?
I would just say, I think you can 100%, knowing what I know about the way to do the contact tracing and the streaming. If we have a student in the class who's in a classroom one day and develops symptoms and tests positive the next day, the entire classroom is going to be subject to quarantine. I wouldn't know how you would get 5 students exposed and 5 students not, actually. It would be one or all.
Peter, you're right. That's what they were doing before. That's what they were doing before, but now I think they're tracking them and making decisions about who's had exposure. So it may not be all the students in the class.
Hold on, I think Danielle's trying to address this.
Okay, but just the point being, when we have exposures in the schools, we have to anticipate that we will have entire classes we have to deal with.
Correct. Under some,
And to be honest, if we have 5 out, if that's the way we may work it, if we have half the class out, probably we would have to send them all out just to continue instruction.
Okay, Danielle, you had some thoughts?
Yes, we've actually talked about this in great depth as an admin team. And I can't speak to like the actual process for COVID per se. We will consult with our nurses. But as far as what happens, well, every week we still plan together as a team. And so virtual and hybrid teachers are still co-planning together. And so what that means, to address your question, Susan, as far as instruction is concerned, our teachers are still on the same cadence as far as instruction. And so if something were to happen where there was an outbreak in the classroom, let's say cohort A with Miss Wright, and there was an outbreak, well, our kiddos would move virtually on the same platform as Seesaw that we would use in the classroom as well. And so then we'll just continue our learning, and it wouldn't just be, here are some assignments, we'll continue the pace that we're at. So
thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, and I thought that there were different requirements. Elementary student up in a classroom and is positive, at one point that was automatic that that whole class would be quarantined, but I thought it was a bit different for high school where you could maybe quarantine. I thought some districts, I don't know what I understood from what I've read, and I've read so much it becomes a blur, but I thought that like a middle and high school, if they're kind of seated together, they look first at, they do contact tracing, but they think about quarantining the immediate 6 people who are right around that student rather than the entire class. But I thought for elementary, it still was the entire class. Is that wrong, Dan, or am I?
Yeah, it's our decision to make, but that's the general practice because if you can, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sean and Krista, but if you can confirm the close contacts, I mean, those are the folks that need to quarantine. And with older kids, sometimes it's easier to confirm whether they've been in close contact with, how many people. With the younger students, it's more difficult to ascertain, and that's where you usually err on the side then of quarantining the entire class.
Okay. So it will depend on those circumstances. Anyone have any other questions? Eric?
Where are we at with substitutes for when our staff do get sick? Or I'm assuming there's a huge shortage. Am I correct with that? Do we have a plan for substitutes when staff will be homesick and cannot work?
You're correct, Eric. There's definitely a shortage. We've had the position posted for quite some time. I've now hired 3 long-term building subs. I'm talking to another candidate tomorrow, but I will let you know we've interviewed everybody who's applied and reached out and extended offers, and people, even if they've applied like 24 hours before and I've contacted them, like sometimes they'll say, I already got another job. So it's very competitive and we're doing what we can.
Okay, I know that. So but I think it's a good sign that you already have hired 3. So that nice work, Nicole and Dan, on at least getting to that point. And I know it's going to continue to be a challenge, especially now. So, but I was just wondering where we're at. It sounds like we're headed in the right direction, and hopefully that we can find more.
Okay. Any further questions on 3.5? And if not, then I would suggest we go ahead and take a motion on this, and then after this we will have more discussion about 6.12 and then a little bit about winter sports as well. But so no further questions. Then I would ask for a motion to approve phase 2 of the updated 2020-2021 reopening plan as presented.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. And now any additional questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. It'll be a roll call vote. Eric?
Aye.
Susan Manning?
Aye.
Lorraine?
Aye.
And Peter?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it. The motion has carried. I do want to take this opportunity, because I meant to say this at the beginning of the meeting and forgot. I was so anxious to get started right away, that Andrew McKinney is unable to be here tonight. He had previously planned to visit his mom before these meetings were planned. These are both special meetings, and I just wanted to make that clear that they were not scheduled initially. He's actually traveling back today, but was not able to get here in time for tonight's meeting. So I just wanted to make that clear. All right, then I guess we would like to go on and talk about where we are with 6.12, and I don't know if you want to talk about middle school first, Dan, or high school first, or all together. How you want to do it?
Susan, can I just ask a real quick question before we start? One of the things I'd like, and probably the end of the meeting is a better place to do this, but I want to try and have a scheduled time to talk about extracurriculars and sports in this depth with people available. Should I just wait till the end and about future meetings?
Right, because what I just mentioned was that I'd like to take care of 6.12, and then I would like to have a brief conversation about winter sports, just to get an idea. Okay. And then we do need another meeting. I am aware that some parents are listening tonight, hoping to hear something about sports, and I'd like to just have a preliminary discussion maybe about that at the end. But let's talk about 6.12 first.
Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, Dan.
Sure. So if I could be, first of all, there just skip ahead. I should have mentioned this earlier and I missed it. MG21, just as a point of reference, they're working on their own reopening plans. They'll be presenting their plans to the MG21 governance board. So as a charter, it will go to that. And I'll certainly keep this board apprised of their planning. They are looking at phasing and doing their middle campus first before their upper campus. So obviously with that being a smaller school, the timeline, might look a little bit different. So I'll give you updates on that planning process as that moves along as well. Okay, so with our grade 6-12, I'm going to ask Lisa to kick us off and just kind of talk in general about the big picture of the planning process and what 6-12 looks like, and then from there, if there's any, we can get to more specific, questions. So Lisa.
Great, thank you, Dan. So as it's been mentioned, we have been talking about hybrid models for quite some time, actually probably since June in a focused way, trying to narrow what would work best for the greatest swath of grade levels. What happens when we start looking at hybrid models for secondary is that there are some significant differences in how students move through their day. So with elementary students, they're with a homeroom teacher. That homeroom teacher is a generalist who is going to cover ELA and math and social studies and science, writing, etc. with that student. When you get to the secondary level, you have teachers who are more specialized into content areas, and students move from class to class to class. So when it comes to looking at really safety protocols that have to do with cohorts of students and isolating them as much as possible in a school, you can imagine how challenging that becomes at a secondary level when students are going to be, in essence, moving throughout the day because they have different teachers for different classes, yet they should be as contained and as isolated in a cohort as possible. So those are some of the things we're trying to balance as we look at hybrid planning for grades 6-12. We know that it will be important for virtually all staff to be involved in the education of the secondary students. It's going to be very difficult to pull out particular staff as virtual staff and other staff as in-person staff. Again, those are really intricate conversations that we need to dig into, particularly once we know some of the choices that our students make about who will return in person and who might remain virtual. But you can imagine that at the high school, for instance, there are quite a few classes that run as singletons. So there aren't multiple sections of the class, there's just one. And that would be a very difficult thing to try to parse out as 10 students who want to return in hybrid and maybe 10 students who want to remain virtual, and then looking at one teacher who's the only teacher who teaches that singleton. So we have to make some hard decisions when it comes to staffing and who's returning in person, and again, how students are receiving that instruction. One of the things that, again, is not necessarily part of our elementary model, but could be part of our secondary model is more of that idea of some concurrent teaching. So we'll have to see, again, where the planning goes with Mitch and Chris and their teams as we move through more details for the return of secondary students to the building. But there's a lot to consider. It isn't as easy as just rolling up to grades 6-8 as it was for grades 3-5. We had spent a lot of time on the 4K-2 hybrid model, and we knew that could roll up to include 3-5 pretty seamlessly. But when it comes to grades 6-12, those present very unique challenges that, again, with the high school and the middle school team, we're going to be delving into once we return from winter break.
Susan Manning?
So go ahead, do you have a question?
So Lisa, would you consider maybe just starting with 6th grade? And maybe that curriculum has changed during my time period, but in the past, that curriculum might be easier to go in person than 7, 8, and 9, 12.
We certainly could use a more granular phased approach for secondary. My reference there to grades 6 through 12 was just that they're taught by more specialized teachers rather than one teacher teaching all subjects. But how the grade levels come back, starting with like 6th grade and then bringing others, I mean, that's a possibility. But 6th grade students do still travel to different teachers for their courses, just like 7th and 8th. So I think the primary difference may be in some of the elective areas where 6th grade is still quote unquote on the wheel, which means they sample all a variety of electives. So they sort of get a little taste of tech ed and FACE and world languages, et cetera. And then in 7th and 8th grade, there's a little more choice, but still the structure of their schedule is very much the same, 6, 7, 8, and then at the high school as well, with students traveling to core and elective teachers throughout their day.
So it's actually, when I think about the middle school, you know, I can kind of picture a little more how you can do this. I guess I'm not sure how to approach this either. With the high school, I know we have the block schedule, but so when I look at, say, Oregon's got this, they're doing the hybrid also, and so 2 days a week, just like ours, but the AB schedule. But so on the A day, though, if your math class meets on the A day, you still could have 28 or 30 students in there. So can you help me get an idea of how we divide those kids? I mean, if they're coming back 2 days a week, and the class only already meets 2 days a week because of the block, I'm just not clear how we get to the numbers, how we cut the numbers down for kids.
Right. So again, those are some of the details that we're going to be exploring with Mitch and Chris and their teams. But for instance, just based on the question you asked, Susan, the current model we're using with elementary for K through 5, it's an AB hybrid. But because the high school and this year, even the middle school, they're doing AB schedule already.
Okay.
If we were going to look and explore a hybrid similar, they would have to be on an AABB hybrid if there was a hybrid to work. But again, some of those details we need to sit down and talk through literally, like, well, what would that mean for student A? What would that mean for teacher B? To really cross-check to see that it's working both for students and for staff, and it's keeping people safe as much as possible. But we definitely couldn't have 28 students return to a classroom because we would not be able to do the physical distancing required in that scenario.
Right, and that makes sense. I'm also envisioning perhaps even more middle and high school kids being ready to come back, so we may have greater numbers, and just wondering how so do we have, well, I'll see if I have other questions, but I'll wait and see who else has questions first. Eric?
My first question is for you, Dan. The next step is to send out surveys to 3-5. We're already got that plan. What would it be beneficial to send out the same surveys to 6-12 too, since you're already doing 3-5 one?
Well, it'll be similar. I think we have to, I think we talked about this last time. I think it might have been Elizabeth that suggested, do you really have to have that final end date in place before you survey? And I think the point is no. I think the earlier we can get the data back, that'll help us with some of that final decision making when we know how many kids are actually going to return. I do think we have to have enough fleshed out, though, that parents can make an informed decision about, in general, what it would look like. So that's why we did put in there, as far as, specifically noting the survey, that, we don't necessarily have to have the final date finalized first. So it'll be a very similar survey, I think, but obviously different, information that go with it. So the 3-5 will go out tomorrow, ready to go on that. And that will be one of the first things we do with 6-12 is develop that survey and get it out as soon as possible.
Okay. And then another question. It seems that the big kind of safety precaution that's being taken into consideration, which is somewhat limiting the talk of the hybrid model versus the in-person model, is the social distancing recommendation from Public Health Madison of Dane County. Am I correct with that? That's really the thing that makes that not possible. So if that were to change, because I know there's been a couple studies of different districts and schools, and I know New York has pretty much already been almost at some schools at full capacity with some success. I mean, if that changes, if the Public Health Madison-Dade County revisits that and there's changes to that, would we be in a position to implement, more students at that time?
No question. That is perhaps one of the major challenges in developing this model. So for instance, there are a lot of schools, secondary schools outside of Dane County, where they don't have the requirement. Certainly they still have the recommendation to do the best they can with physical distancing, but they are still choosing to use the hybrid model to still try to reduce the number of students in the school. So for instance, just our neighboring schools in the Badger Conference outside of Dane County, a number of those are doing, the AB, splitting kids in half. And it's pretty easy. They, usually they'll go alphabetical, half the kids on one day, the other half on the other, but they don't have to come out perfectly even. So if you've got 24 kids in a class, instead of 12 and 12, it might be, 16 on one day and 8 on the other, and they're making that work, where that's not necessarily a option for us. We have to have the classes more even to maintain, that distancing. So I think from my perspective, that's the largest challenge that we face, is how do you even out those class sizes?
In the research and studies I've read, I'm not seeing a significant increase in cases or transmission, even with schools that don't have a strict distancing in place. So that's why I'm just thinking that could potentially be revisited and looked at. Because I've always advocated for whether the hybrid is a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, or a fully integrated model. So that's not even hybrid, because I really think you're going to see a huge shift from a lot of schools now to try to get back to in session, full day, full week classes and learning, because I think we all know where we're at, and we've been experiencing this for quite a while, and we know the precautions. I know there are businesses that have been open with success. There are some, certainly a path to success using the proper safety precautions. And I would just hate to be a little bit behind, especially I know Madison on January 8th has an announcement coming that they're going to be talking about their plan. So I just want to be prepared for if that change happens, or if we can make that shift and adjustment when it comes, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one real quick point, and you made a good one. The as far as the requirement with the physical distancing, that was a topic of discussion at our meeting last week with Public Health. They are continually reviewing the research that is out there. At this point, they have found that there's not indication that they're enough to make them change that, but they are continually reviewing that, certainly. The other thing is, I made that statement about what I believe other schools are doing, and I know Mitch is in constant communication with his colleagues in other high schools. So I want to make sure I didn't misspeak there. And Mitch, is that kind of your understanding as well as far as the challenge about dividing the cohorts equally. I don't want to speak for you on that piece.
No, that's definitely one of the challenges. And then just thinking about as students travel from class to class, you may be balanced in one class, but let's say you have English 9 and then you have another section of English 9. Your first one might be 10 kids, and then just running the schedule, the next one could have 17. Then we need to adjust and figure out, okay, how do we adjust to that, because we can't have 17 in a class. So once we have the information about students that would opt for cohort C or virtual, and then we divide up our two cohorts, then we'll start to look at the numbers and see where those balancing issues surface, and then start to troubleshoot.
Other questions, Lorraine?
I should have asked this also with the younger grades, but with the older grades, the achievement gap, are there any major concerns of closing their achievement gap even more so with the virtual learning?
I think we're gonna have to be attentive to all students when they come back, Lorraine, and particularly students that show a slide in skill development that resulted from trying to learn in a virtual environment that wasn't optimal. And so thinking about how important checks for understanding are normally in a teaching day, as we come back out of virtual 2.0, that's going to be even more important to underscore and think about checks for understanding. And if students aren't there yet, how do we reteach and get them there?
I have a follow-up question about that. So when they do come back, are we going to be kind of aggressive to try to help those students a little bit more? Is there a plan in place, I guess?
Yeah, at the high school, that'll be a staff-wide conversation as well as one that takes place in our teams, and putting our heads together around what the best approach there is. And at the high school, we've had programs like overtime or opportunities for more, but what can we do in the core classroom area that helps all students, and particularly kids that have slipped, like I said.
And Lorene, if I could offer too, I think I might reframe that in a little bit of a different way as well. Because some of what we speak of as an achievement gap is usually illustrated on, let's say, performance on a standardized test. And we have to remember that a standardized test is simply one measure. It's not the only measure. And I would say our students have been learning amazing things trying to navigate a pandemic and learn in situations that they haven't had to learn before. So they've learned new ways to communicate and new ways to process information and different ways to advocate for what they need and how to interact with others. It really, if we look at some of the new skill development that has emerged over these last 10 months or so, I think our students are learning quite a bit that may not ever show up on a standardized test per se. But we will continue to do what we can to formatively assess students both virtually and when they're in person, and then continue to progress monitor and provide the type of instruction that helps them build on those skills and core content knowledge that we know will help them move forward.
Will resource centers, departmental resource centers be staffed in some way? I was just thinking that's another area where if a student needed some extra help on a particular subject and could go there, but realizing how difficult all the staffing is going to be, I just didn't know if that might be available or if that could be even available with paraprofessionals as well, or you had any conversation about that?
At the high school, our resource centers are currently staffed virtual.
So they're totally virtual. So
but they're
could there be
staffed.
some conversation about in person, if we have significant kids in person, which I'm sure we will, if we could look at some way to maybe staff them in person as well, or have whoever's staffing them virtually be physically in the high school, or some way to have somebody there, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think you're right. You want to serve the students that are there virtually as well as, think about, or that are there in person, as well as think about a student that's virtual that day. If they need assistance, how could they get it?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Chris?
Lorraine,
Yeah.
just in, with your question, one of the things that we've been talking about, just our student services, is one way is while we send out the parent survey and we ask the parent questions, and then for some families who maybe don't return the surveys, we'll call them individually. But also maybe there's some families that we need to call individually and talk to about the benefits of coming back if we feel a student may need that, just a little bit more of a nudge for certain reasons. And I think that the question about the resource centers is one that's weighing heavily on my mind with the return of 6-8. I know that student services staff and resource staff is so crucial to students in middle school who are struggling with engagement, behavior, mental health, whatever. But how do we make that circle of people bigger, right? Like when we're supposed to be keeping the circle of people small, but yet how do we get access to those people and hopefully out of the virtual world and more into person. So that's one of the things that we've been starting to just toss around as well. It's a hard answer right now.
Right. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I have a question for Lisa, Mitch, and Chris, any combination there. Knowing that middle school and high school teaching and learning is not near my area of expertise at all, but I feel like we always talk about the challenges with the kids moving, and I'm curious to know, are there any models out there where it's the adults that move to the kids instead, especially like on maybe the lower end of the grade bands where the schedules are more predictable, or thinking about like using, asynchronous or even virtual instruction, in a classroom. So maybe kids are in different classes, but there's an adult there sort of more proctoring. So just curious if there's models like that have been successful that might make the logistical planning easier.
I don't know if right now we can say that the other models are successful. We can say that there certainly are people who are trying a variety of things. So
that's fair, Lisa. Thank you.
that notion of housing students in a room and having kids continue to engage virtually. Sure, that's an option. I think there's drawbacks of that, right? Like, so you're not virtual at home, but now you're virtual at school, but you're cohorted and you're not moving and you're still contacting your teacher, that's, again, those are all things we need to talk about. I think the true, the difficulty is this: if you imagine let's say first hour in English 9 class, and you've got 10 kids which show up in cohort A, but those 10 kids, where they go second hour could be 10 different classes. And so now they were together for 1 hour, but then they spread out all over. And so it really becomes very difficult when you're trying to match what kids are taking in their core classes and their elective classes, and how to do that safely. So yeah, those are all, we have examples from all over that different schools are trying. And so, we'll talk through all of those different possibilities, but it's hard to say right now, like, here's the model that works best, because if there was one,
then you'd have presented it to us.
Yeah, everybody'd be doing it.
Yeah, no, I get that. Thank you. Sorry, I'm laughing because you answered that question with such grace and loveliness around, like, well, we could house the children exactly the same way as they're housed at home, Elizabeth. So that's why I'm chuckling, because I recognize on the outset that it was an interesting question to even ask.
Other questions on 612? Do we have even a rough, it sounds like there's still a lot of work to do, but a rough ballpark figure of timing for this, of how quickly we could get those kids back in?
Yeah, really good question, an important question. Last time when we spoke, we initially said, well, clearly, by fourth quarter, I mean, that's we would want that. We do feel confident that we'll be able to target the time during third quarter. So I'm hesitant to put a date out there. We've talked about some dates, but
Like maybe, I mean,
I'm sorry.
sorry, I just had internet, some kind of lapse. So I missed part of what you said there. I guess I was in my mind, hoping it would be before fourth quarter,
Yes.
maybe more like March or I don't know, early March.
So yeah, we are very confident it'll be before the fourth quarter, sometime during the third. And I think the next time we come together, our goal is to have a date for you.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks.
Sorry, can you remind me when that, I know you don't want to give a date, Dan, I get that, but I'm just trying to decipher.
Sure. Yeah, no, really good point. So the fourth quarter actually is the end of March. So basically April 5th, April 6th is when the fourth quarter starts. So.
Got it. So sometime before spring break would be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Early March would be great.
Uh-huh.
March 1st, maybe. I don't know. I'm pushing a little bit because I think it'd be great to be able to have a month in before spring break. I mean, these are hard decisions. I get that, hard conversations, but it seems like it's just a matter of really getting together, nailing it down, and then moving. And so I would hope that, that could happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
All right. Then we do want to have a little bit of discussion about winter sports and where we're at that. Does anyone have any further questions about 612? Okay. Then I'm not sure where to start this, but we've all obviously gotten a lot of emails and have a lot of thoughts about winter sports and whether there's any way. We are aware that the small group practices will start the week of January 4, but questions have been raised about games, and knowing that requires at this point going outside Dane County, that has been a subject of conversation. And Dan, do you want to say a little bit about, because this came up in your meeting last Friday with the Dane County people, I think the regular weekly phone call, about why they have kind of made this recommendation to give us more flexibility with returning to class, but not so with athletic competitions?
Sure. So, without question, this is something that every school district is having conversations about. And so we did have a conversation with public health and tried to get an idea, is there any chance that they will be making any modifications to their requirements when it comes to sports and competitions and practices and so on. And the short answer was no, they are not considering modifications to it. And the reason is everything that we're doing in the schools instructionally, okay, even with the latest revisions to their updates, there's, we've talked about this before, there are three key things about how you keep staff and students safe, right? We all wear masks, we wash our hands, and we physically distance. And so everything that's done in their requirements is with the requirement that you physically distance with the greatest extent possible. And that's why they separated their sports requirements into three categories: high, medium, and low risk sports. And so the low risk sports are the ones that are generally done on an individual basis. Golf, cross country, tennis. And so what they've said in their requirements is as long as you can do those and maintain physical distance, then you can not only, have those practices, but compete. With the medium and high risk, those are all ones that the competition, by their very nature, students are within 6 feet of one another, through the competition. And that's what they're, why they are saying, those are restricted, is because they want to, maintain that. They said basically if you can modify those to maintain the distancing, you're allowed to do that. But that's the rationale, not arguing right or wrong, but that's the rationale behind the requirements.
Dan, I have a comment and then a question. My comment is, we have students now in hockey and basketball, and they are playing outside of Dane County right now. And they are playing outside of Dane County and not being required to follow WIAA safety precautions. I believe it would be much safer if we had more control, meaning more chance to implement the safety precautions put in place, even if they were playing outside of Dane County, but following the WIAA safety precautions and rules. I think if we go back to school and we have these students continuing to play sports, particularly basketball and hockey, outside of Dane County and not following those precautions, which are not always required, not that our students aren't following, but there are other communities that aren't as strict as Dane County.
Bogey boy.
And they will be coming back into our schools and have a greater chance of, spreading COVID-19. So I guess, I think it may actually be safer to have a little bit more coordination with WIAA and the safety precautions put in place, even if they were playing outside of Dane County. And then my question is there a current plan that we have in place right now to play games outside of Dane County? And if there is not a plan, would it be possible to put something together to see what that would look like?
So the answer to the question is no, there's not a plan. And the second part, could a plan be put in place? Yes.
And then, how do you feel about, do you understand what I'm saying though? Like, what's happening now, if we open schools and we have students that are going outside and they're coming back into the schools, that it could be potentially actually be a greater risk than if we were, kind of sanctioning the games outside of Dane County. Does my logic kind of make sense? You see where I'm coming from?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah, my understanding is part of the problem, though, the sense is that, again, there hasn't been a lot of spread through group sports. There isn't a lot of data to support that one way or the other. So that's been one of the issues with that. But I'm wondering, I think there is an interest in exploring this. And I know we have some complications. I did check today, we have 70 boys out for boys basketball. So, there are some big numbers to think about. So there are a lot of logistical things as well as legal questions and other questions. But I just wondered if anybody else, I kind of had some of the same thoughts, I guess, that knowing that a lot of our kids currently are out playing league play, and if we did offer school competitions, they would not be able to participate in leagues, and it would be sort of a safer way. Plus, that is what a lot of them would prefer to do. And the other piece about it, I guess, that makes me think more about it as an option is because it would be a totally voluntary thing. As coming back to school in person is also voluntary because we're giving parents that choice. But parents and students could make that choice together if they wanted to take that risk. And there are waivers available, and we do seem to have a lot of interest. So I guess I feel like it does merit more discussion. I don't know if other people want to weigh in. I would look to maybe scheduling another meeting to have a little more lengthy discussion about it. But Peter, and then Susan, is that your hand up? Then Lorraine. Okay.
I guess my first comment is that the number one thing we can do for students, athletes, everybody, is put this pandemic in the rearview mirror. Overall, completely. And anything that we do or consider, I think, needs to be compatible with that goal. Now, we don't know specifically what those are, but we can, we have some good data and some information that helps us get there. But whatever we do, we need to have number one, getting this pandemic behind us. Part of the difference between, the Dane County health recommendations do recognize the difference between kids under the age of 12, 13 and high school students in their ability to contract and spread and suffer from complications of this virus. As fortunately as I look around, I can't support using a legal loophole to go around the guidance that we have, particularly from part of it's a liability point of view. If we are told you can't do this and we go outside the county to do it, yes, that's legal, but I doubt there's a liability waiver that absolves us from liability if we go against a well-defined, well-founded recommendation from Dane County Health. I mean, the courts look at liability waivers very, very carefully. Wisconsin is one of only 6 states in which you can sign a liability waiver for children at all. In most other states, there is no liability waiver that can cover children. And in Wisconsin, they're very carefully scrutinized and very carefully restricted. For example, they have to be negotiable in order to be legal. A waiver of liability in Wisconsin has to be negotiable. And so if you write a waiver, what part, if you think about it, what parts are going to be negotiable? And I'm referring to a 2013 court case that defines what's legal, what's required of waivers in Wisconsin. So it's a real, I doubt that we could absolve ourselves of legal jeopardy with liability waivers. Even some of the things I've seen from other school districts seem to me to have issues. I'm not a lawyer, but I know it's a dicey situation. However, it just doesn't seem right to me we would sort of take a legal loophole. We should do everything we can to provide safe activities to our students, but they've got to be within what we believe is the right thing to do in terms of, like I said, putting this pandemic in the rearview mirror.
Okay, Susan and then Lorraine.
I really strongly support that we continue this discussion. I think each and every board member should be able to put their opinion forward. I read the law differently than Peter does. I've also researched the cases extensively. It was my impression, and I think Dan has supported this, it's my impression from Mike Jelka that we could use a waiver. And it was also my impression that Dan had said, if we need Mike Jelka to come in and talk to us about this in a discussion. So I think before we get too deep and too emotional on this, I think we need to find, if we have a consensus, to come back and have a full discussion on this. And again, I've done a ton of research now. I've talked to a lot of athletic directors to find out what they're doing. I've tried to see where we are. And the other thing that's interesting is you look at the fact that, 10 days ago, we weren't even looking forward at 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12. And because Dane County now has new data and new research, they are looking at that. So I think we need to keep our minds open as to what's possible. And then, so I'd really, really like us to schedule within the next week or 10 days, if possible, before they go back on January 4th, to give them that possibility. And then on top of that, Dan, I have a specific question about the swimming. There's something about they have to have 4 competitions to be able to have sectionals. And you had kind of mentioned that they were going to try and do like swimming competitions virtually. Once we get past the meeting issue, if you could just update us on that, that would be nice. Thank
So
you.
I did ask Mr. Schreiner today that for whatever, anticipating that we're going to have this at a near future board meeting, to have a specific update for each specific sport to answer that. And because I saw the email that came in, I did refer that to Mr. Schreiner, and so I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, the board will get an update on what is the status of every sport.
That'd be great.
Okay, and then Lorraine, did you have?
Yeah, Susan actually kind of talked about it. So I'm on the same page that I would like to explore a little bit more about the waivers. I'm gonna learn from our school attorney if a little bit more about that. The other was, I know I mentioned the coaches meeting, having a meeting with that. Is that something on the radar to talk to coaches to get feedback from them?
Yes, there's a couple of options there. So we have had that, and so I guess I'm not prepared right now to say exactly how that would do it, but you absolutely could make sure that you get that feedback. Yes.
Great. And then the last question I had is, are there other schools within Dane County that are going outside to play?
Sure. So, so I met, as you know, we meet every Friday with the Dane County superintendents, and as of Friday, there were 2 public schools who were approved to do that, and you're aware of those, Marshall and Belleville. There are 5 schools where their board is considering this week. I think 4 are meeting this evening, 1 is meeting tomorrow.
And
are you in contact with the superintendents at all, just to kind of learn about what they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so by the time we meet again, I'll actually, we'll have updated information. I'll know by tomorrow what the status is of each of those. But they're all having very similar conversations that you are right now.
Thank you, Dan.
So could we do, oh, Eric, I'm sorry. You have a
well,
question?
I guess I was just curious if other board members would also be interested in seeing a plan to maybe have a discussion off of a plan that would involve playing games outside of Dane County, since that doesn't exist right now. I know I'm interested in that.
And Eric, I do not mean to interrupt, but I received information that DeForest School Board approved playing outside Dane County tonight. Sorry, I apologize. I apologize.
No, that's fine. That's even more reason why I would like to see a plan that involves playing outside of Dane County. Dan, I don't know if you can talk to Jeff and maybe work with him what that might involve as far as things like transportation, safety precautions put in place, and schedule of games would be the 3 things that would be interested in seeing.
Yeah, and let me I appreciate that, Eric. And let me clarify, when I said there's not a plan, there's not been a written plan put in place as far as like the proposal to the board. Jeff and I have talked about that. I know Mitch and Jeff have talked about that at length. I can give you this, the short answer is, I mean, transportation is simple. We provide transportation for any student activity, period. Now, what we're doing with our reopening of our elementary schools, we are encouraging parents who have the means to be able to transport their own children to try to reduce the number of people that we have to transport. My guess is that we would have something very similar for any kind of activities, but we, without question, would transport, anyone that needed transportation. As far as the protocols in general, if something like this were to happen, once those students were at a site outside of Dane County, the protocols would be the protocols of that host school about how they conduct the activities, in general. And of course,
we could also have our own protocols that might not align. For instance, I think I saw a basketball game, one team was wearing masks and the other wasn't. So, if we set some standards based on our own safety protocols, our team will follow those protocols, even if they go to a school that doesn't follow them. And that goes back to us having the safety precautions we feel that are right for our district in place. So when our students come back in the schools, they're not at greater risk of spreading.
Thank you, Eric, for that clarification. You're absolutely right. We can do that. And by the way, as of right now, there is, of course, still a statewide mask order. So that should be occurring at every high school in the state. But you're right. I would agree that we should have our own.
Susan?
So Dan, my impression is that Wanakee did approve going back, playing out of Dane County last week. No,
it's not correct. Their board authorized, they have an extracurricular committee. They authorized that committee to make a decision. That committee's meeting tomorrow.
Well, I guess what I'd like to do, because this time is of the essence with this, in that my understanding is because the Badger Conference basically is about out of the picture. So the coaches would have to set up their games. And one of the things, I did have a conversation with one coach who said that, for example, you might have the varsity play one night, a junior varsity or a freshman play a different night, depending on numbers of people. Boys basketball would be way more complicated. To try to split up the busing, and we would not allow audiences, for example, not how that factors in when you go to another school. If you can say, we're willing to play, but we will not be bringing our parents, your parents. I mean, the idea would be only home team parents would play mostly, would be what would be encouraged, and people would be wearing masks. If this were to happen. So it depends on whether they can find that many teams to play, which they won't necessarily people would have a freshman team. So there are a lot of different things to look at in terms of numbers, and I guess even focusing on seniors and just saying maybe varsity has actual games and underclassmen have scrimmages, or I mean that I don't know if that's possible. I mean, just looking at a number of 70 boys, if we would do something like this. So I don't know. I think there are a lot of possibilities, but I think we do need another meeting sooner, is what I was getting to. And I think you had mentioned that Mike Julka might be available to come talk further about the legal issues so that everybody has a clear idea, because I know the subject of waivers is, it is a subject that I'd like to hear him say more about. And if we could do that sooner rather than later, I mean, I'm even thinking this week, possibly, or if not, next week. I mean, I'm kind of assuming we're all going to be around, even though I know it's break. So I don't know what people's preferences would be, but.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would suggest that when you meet that we do have Mike Julka available. If you recall the information that I'd shared with the board from another attorney that Mr. Julka had shared, he said he was in general agreement with, but he also made clear that this was not direct advice for our school district. So I think you would need to hear from him directly. Right. And as you mentioned, he could speak directly to the waiver issue. So I would schedule him. And then the other questions about scheduling and so on, Mr. Schreiner absolutely can answer. Be prepared to speak to those.
And would we be able to have some type of outline of a potential plan, just detailing those things, Dan? It's like something on paper that we could see.
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, if we would make this kind of change, they do need time to set up those games. I mean, it sounds to me like there's a lot of that would have to be done after the fact. That's why it's
important. The plan might say set so and so date set up games, or something like that. But I'm not expecting it all to happen. I just kind of want to see an outline of.
Right. I was just thinking in terms of when we might have this meeting to discuss this further and make some kind of decision to give them enough lead time is what I was thinking. But Susan?
Well, and it's also interesting. It also would be nice, again, to have that Dane County Public Health sports guidance, because I'm sitting right here. And the question is it okay to hold sports competitions? And we already understand this. Yes, for low risk sports with 6 foot physical distancing, which I think you probably can do for swimming. I mean, we used to do that. But the other interesting thing is it very specifically says medium and high risk sports game and competitions between teams are not allowed. Then they define teams. Medium risk and high risk sports may play games. So Susan, I think that goes exactly to what you're talking about. You could take a certain group out of Dane County, and then the other groups could play as teams. I'm just reading the Dane County language, but we just haven't had. I really feel as a board member, I've done a ton of research, but I really feel like I need Jeff and the coaches to really school me on these issues so that I can help support administration making an informed decision. And I would meet as soon as possible because this plan needs time. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only low risk sports are individual swimming. Relays do not count. So you can't.
Right, right, not relays, so right.
That's medium risk, and then.
You can put them 3 lanes apart.
Yeah, except wrestling is a individual.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Be tough. So there are some. I mean, the list is pretty.
Can you do that virtually?
Medium risk, so they are going to come under these. Would have to be outside Dane County mostly. Well, anyway, I guess then what do we want to throw out some dates? I mean, is it ridiculous to think we'd meet again this week, or are we looking at next week?
No, I think we should meet this week if we can.
I'd be willing to meet like
athletes and
tomorrow, Wednesday. I mean, part of this depends on Mike Jilkin's. I'm sorry, Eric, what?
I just said, I know it's difficult, but I think it's important. If we can do it, we should try to do it.
I can also meet on Wednesday.
I can meet on Wednesday.
Actually, I can meet tomorrow too, but.
Do that too.
And I can also meet Monday on the 28th.
Hold on, because this will partly depend upon Mike Jilka's availability, so.
Right, and Wednesday, Lorene, Andrew, and I have a meeting with the Village of Cottage Grove, their housing task force. So Wednesday's not a good evening. Could I suggest that I start with dates with Mike Jilka, and then tomorrow we immediately, get back to you with some potential dates and get something scheduled?
I think that would help.
Idea. We're actually into next week anyway because of the posting requirement that we have to have 24 hours to post. So we already can't do it tomorrow anyway. So
yeah, so we're looking at the 28th.
So we're looking at the week of the 28th,
okay,
possibly.
But why would I don't know, Peter? Were you
why don't we just see if we can do it Monday or Tuesday, the 29th, 28th or 29th? Just and Dan, maybe that isn't a date Mike Jilka can do it, but at least. Then you don't have to go back to 7 people right away. It gives you some options. So again, I'm available month 28th, 29th.
Just a point, Eric, the earliest we could schedule this week is Thursday to comply with the open rec meetings.
Well, right, we aren't going to be doing that. So
we're looking at Monday, Tuesday next week.
So we're looking at Monday and Tuesday, 28th or 29th. Likely, which either of those were fine with me, but
yeah. Heck, I'm not doing anything for Christmas this year.
Don't you have company at your house teaching school in Washington, D.C.?
Hopefully everybody will take a little bit of time to take a break and a breather. So
yeah.
Again, we'll survey you, but one of the things that we'll ask if there's any availability earlier as opposed to an evening meeting. Would be helpful, or may be helpful for some.
Right. Let's see. I probably have a plan commission meeting on the 28th, but if that's the one where our athletic field is coming, I can't weigh in on that anyway. So I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd be fine with doing it earlier too. So. Why don't you plan to send us some possibilities and then
we'll get some dates out to you tomorrow.
Sure, that'd be great.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Let's see, anything else? So otherwise, we have a personnel meeting tomorrow. Otherwise, the next regular board meeting is January 13, so we will at least have this meeting before that.
So Susan, is your personnel meeting discussion or is it mostly negotiation?
It's actually just our committee. It's not
okay.
With the teachers tomorrow, so it's just our committee.
And then Peter's been, that's really tough. You've been having sustainability on Saturday mornings. That's tough.
That's when everybody else wanted it. And in fact, we've got our next one scheduled for Saturday, the 26th.
26th, I know. You're going to have to record those so we can watch.
Well, if you're
good meeting.
They are
them on a Saturday.
Yeah.
They're open. Yeah, that's right.
Anybody's anybody's welcome to join, at those and listen in on that. It's very interesting. We're making a lot of progress.
Well, if there's no further business, then I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, Susan. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Eric?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Peter?
Aye.
Lorene?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Aye. Then the motion carries. We are adjourned. All right, so we'll look forward to hearing from you, Dan.